Mist coils over the endless green ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, the trees standing like sentinels beneath a heavy grey sky. A drone's camera glides low through the fog, revealing the crumbling skeleton of Black Hollow Church, its rotted timbers and fractured stone walls barely holding their shape. Ivy and decay have almost reclaimed the structure, but something lingers, stubborn, silent beneath the earth. Buried beneath this rotting chapel are secrets the soil tried to swallow, but the bones refused to stay quiet. For decades, the dense forests surrounding Black Hollow whispered their warnings, stories of vanishings, strange symbols carved into ancient oaks, and unsettling shadows slipping between the trees. Locals spoke of something older, darker than the church itself, something not bound by time or belief. Now, the forgotten mass grave beneath Black Hollow Church has finally been unearthed. At the edge of the ruins, the yellow flutter of police. Tape cuts through the mist like a wound. Archaeologists, clad in rain gear and latex gloves, comb through the mud, lifting fragments of bone from shallow, hurried graves. Skull fragments, jawbones, rusted jewelry, the dead pulled back into the light after decades underground. Over their work, the faded edges of police reports materialize. Missing persons lists, hand-drawn maps, evidence photos curled with age. Faces stare out from black and white portraits. Lost hikers, vanished townsfolk, entire families whose trails went cold within these woods. But this is no isolated tragedy. It's the gateway to something far more sprawling, a hidden history of disappearances, cult symbols, forbidden rituals, and a darkness that has rippled through this region for generations. And as the earth reluctantly gives up its secrets, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Whatever was buried here never truly stayed dead. Tucked deep within the forgotten hills of West Virginia lies Black Hollow, a place most maps barely acknowledge, and even fewer outsiders have reason to visit. Once, this remote Appalachian town pulsed with life, built on the brittle promise of coal seams and hard labor. Archival photographs flicker across the screen, soot-streaked miners emerging from tunnels, narrow streets lined with sagging porches, tired faces hardened by generations of poverty and isolation. But the boom years are long gone. The mines collapsed, the jobs vanished, and Black Hollow withered into a ghost of itself, a forgotten outpost clinging to the edges of Appalachia, shrouded in silence and suspicion at the town's heart. Into the overgrown hillside stands Black Hollow Church. Abandoned since 1971, its decaying frame rises like a skeleton against the mist. Its steeple broken, its stained glass fractured and mottled with moss. The surrounding cemetery sprawls into the forest, headstones cracked and tilted, names eroded. By rain and time, rusting iron gates sag from their hinges, vines creeping over rusted bars like nature trying to reclaim the sins beneath. But the church is more than just a relic of neglect. It casts a long, heavy shadow over Black Hollow, one thick with whispered warnings and unresolved dread. Locals speak of it only in hushed tones, lowering their voices when the subject arises. Stories surface of people who wandered too close to the church and never returned. Of strange gatherings beneath moonless skies, figures silhouetted in the ruins. Of symbols carved into the trees, unfamiliar and unsettling. And of the secrets sealed beneath its rotting floorboards, secrets that the land itself tried to bury. Now, with the recent unearthing of human remains beneath Black Hollow Church, those long-buried fears have clawed their way back to the surface, and for the first time in decades, The shadows of Black Hollow are stirring. At the center of Black Hollow's unsettling history stood one man, Reverend Elijah Merrick. Photographs from the era show him in stark black and white, sharp features, piercing eyes, always dressed in his weathered clerical coat. To the outside world, Merrick was everything a small, fractured town like Black Hollow could want: charismatic, devout, unwavering in his mission to guide his congregation through poverty and despair. But beneath the polished sermons and steadfast gaze, whispers told a different story. His followers weren't merely devout, they were fanatical, unusually private, fiercely loyal. The church doors might have been open to all, but what happened inside was another matter entirely. It was around this time, the late 1960s, into the early 70s, that the disappearances began. They started quietly, almost brushed off as coincidence, as life slipping away in a place already gripped by hardship. But patterns emerged. First, Alice Carter, 17, bright, well-liked, vanished, walking home from choir practice one autumn evening. Her bike was found abandoned near the church's front steps, her songbook scattered in the leaves. She was never seen again. Then came Matthew Griggs, 10 years old, last spotted outside Sunday school, tossing stones into the creek that winds through the woods. His jacket washed up downstream days later. His small shoes were discovered at the forest's edge. No trace beyond that. The list of the missing stretched on, quiet at first, but undeniable as the years passed. Faces printed on fading posters, names exchanged in cautious conversations at the diner or whispered during church potlucks. The townsfolk, already hardened by mine closures and economic collapse, learned to bury more than just their dead. They buried their fears, their suspicions, their grief. Newspaper clippings from the time paint a haunting picture. Asterisk hollow child missing. Search called off. Community rallies in prayer. But beneath the surface, people stopped believing this was just bad luck. Strange symbols began appearing carved into trees near the church. Campfire tales of eerie chanting drifting through the woods at night circulated among teenagers. Those closest to Reverend Merrick grew more distant, more guarded, protective of something no one could name. And then, one day, it all ended. The church, once the center of Black Hollow, was shuttered overnight, officially. Decline, dwindling, attendance, economic hardship, the standard story in Appalachia's forgotten corners. But privately, among hushed voices and sideways glances, people spoke of something darker. Something happened inside those walls, something that pushed even the most loyal followers away. The church decayed where it stood, untouched, avoided, its long shadow lingering. Decades passed. The disappearances faded into local myth. But now, with the unearthing of the mass grave beneath Black Hollow Church, those old fears no longer feel like folklore. They feel like unfinished business. And at the heart of it all still looms the unsettling legacy of Reverend Elijah Merrick. Began. As these things often do, quietly subtle ripples beneath the surface of an already uneasy town. The first whispers came from hunters and farmers, those who knew the land like the lines on their weathered palms. They spoke of lights deep in the forest, glimpses of flickering orange flames where no campsite should be, lanterns swaying in the fog, strange movements in the distance, shadows threading between the trees like something half seen, half imagined. At first, no one paid it much mind. In a place like Black Hollow, the forest has always held secrets. But these weren't just campfires or wayward hikers. Something felt different. As the weeks turned into months, more unsettling reports emerged. Chants, low and rhythmic, carried across the hills on the night wind. Faint, guttural hymns in no recognizable language weaving through the valleys long after dark. The sound unsettled even the most practical townsfolk. Experienced woodsmen who'd spent their lives in the hills now hesitated to wander after dusk. It wasn't long before the sightings escalated. Hooded figures seen at the tree line, silhouettes draped in dark robes, standing motionless among the oaks, bonfires igniting in hidden clearings, casting warped, flickering shapes along the forest floor. Those brave enough to get close reported circles of figures swaying to a deep, primal rhythm, their faces hidden, their voices low and foreign, as if chanting from another time entirely. Sheriff's Department, logs from 1968 through 1971 document the mounting unease, a steady stream of calls reporting disturbances in the woods. Unidentified gatherings, ritual activity near Black Hollow Church. But for all the complaints, no arrests were ever made. Every time deputies were dispatched, the forest stood empty. Bonfire ashes cooled in the damp soil. Symbols were carved into tree trunks, but the hooded figures had melted away, leaving only silence and the lingering stench of burnt offerings. The reports grew darker still. Farmers discovered livestock, mutilated goats and calves' throats, neatly slit, organs missing, drained of blood with surgical precision. Dogs found dead at the edges of properties, strange symbols carved into their hides. Small totems, bundles of twigs and bones left hanging from fence posts or nailed to barn doors. The carved symbols began appearing more frequently, etched into trees, scrawled onto cabin walls, even burned into front porches. Unfamiliar, angular shapes that seemed to twist and writhe when caught in the corner of one's eye. With each incident, the old legends resurfaced, stories that predated Reverend Merrick, that had clung to the hollow long before Black Hollow. Church ever cast its shadow? The elders spoke of the hollow ones, a whispered name passed between generations, never fully explained, but always carrying the same heavy, unspoken meaning. Those who never left, and never fully belonged. Outcasts, witches, devotees of something far older than the town itself. Figures who slipped between the cracks of society, retreating into the mountains, trading their humanity for secrecy and something darker. Officially, there was no proof. The sheriff's office chalked up the mutilations to predators, the lights to pranksters, the symbols to bored teenagers. But behind closed doors, fear spread like wildfire. Parents forbade their children from wandering after dark. Church attendance surged, driven by desperation rather than faith. And yet, Black Hollow Church itself, once a sanctuary, became a place of suspicion. Reverend Merrick's congregation grew increasingly isolated, their services stretching late into the night, windows shuttered, voices rising in tones that chilled those passing by. By the time the first children disappeared, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. The strange gatherings, the mutilations, the symbols, they were no longer isolated incidents, but threads in a web tightening around Black Hollow. Yet still, the authorities did little. Official explanations smothered public outcry. Reports vanished. Witnesses stopped talking. And always, in the shadows of the forest and the rotting church, the chants continued. Low, ancient, impossible to forget, as if the hills themselves were awakening to something buried beneath the soil, something that piece by piece was clawing its way back into the world. As the strange events in Black Hollow escalated, the town itself began to fracture along familiar, uneasy lines. Some residents dismissed the whispers as nothing more than superstition, mountain myths fueled by isolation, poverty, and fear of the unknown. In these rugged Appalachian hills, stories had always flourished, especially when hardship set in. They blamed the sightings, the symbols, even the disappearances on folklore, natural byproduct of generations spent living on the edge of forgotten America. The forests were vast, the nights were long, and the human mind, they insisted, had a tendency to wander into dark places when left unchecked. But others weren't so quick to explain it all away. Behind closed doors, in hushed conversations over coffee, or in the quiet corners of the general store, people spoke of the missing. They recited the names like an unspoken prayer. Liz Carter, Matthew Griggs, Leah Sanderson, the Hollow Boys from up on Fairview Road. Teenagers, children, even adults who had seemingly vanished into thin air. The official explanations, runaways, accidents, wild animals, felt thinner with each passing year, especially when those disappearances always seemed to circle back to one place, Black Hollow Church. It was impossible to ignore the growing suspicion that the church, and more specifically, Reverend Elijah Merrick, was at the heart of it all. His sermons had grown increasingly private, his followers more secretive, their gatherings stretching late into the night behind locked doors and shuttered windows. Those who once attended Sunday services out of obligation or tradition quietly drifted away, unsettled by the hushed tones, the cryptic symbols scrawled into hymn books, and the closed circles that formed among Merrick's most loyal parishioners. Rumors surfaced of private ceremonies held well past midnight, flickering candlelight seen from the edges of town, strange hymns carried on the wind, the faint but undeniable sound of chanting echoing through the trees. Some spoke of sacrifices, though no one could or would say exactly what that meant. The few who questioned Merrick's practices directly found themselves ostracized, shut out by neighbors, their jobs jeopardized, their reputations smeared. And always, there was the looming reminder that those who pushed too hard sometimes disappeared altogether. The tension spread like a virus. Families turned inward. Once bustling storefronts stood empty, windows boarded over as more residents packed up and left. Those who remained divided into two camps, those who dismissed the growing unease as paranoia, and those who saw the signs, the symbols on the trees, the mutilated animals, the missing persons reports, and believed something darker was festering. Beneath the surface, local radio broadcasts from the late 60s capture the growing rift. Grainy recordings of call-in shows reveal the deepening paranoia. One caller, his voice shaking, recounts hearing guttural hymns outside his cabin near the tree line. Another accuses outsiders of fueling the fear, insisting the tales are nothing but exaggerated folklore meant to smear a man of God. The hosts tread carefully, unwilling to ignite the already simmering powder keg, but the evidence was impossible to dismiss entirely. Grainy black and white photographs show small, scattered protests outside Black Hollow Church, handmade signs reading asterisk, "Where are our children?" and asterisk, "End the secrecy." Merrick's followers, cloaked in their loyalty, met the protests with cold, stony silence. The church became an island desolated, fortified, its decaying steeple casting a crooked shadow across the town like a scar. Despite mounting pressure, no concrete action was taken. The sheriff's department, underfunded and overwhelmed, offered platitudes but little else. Official statements cited lack of evidence, dismissed reports as rumor, and warned residents against vigilante action. Those with connections to the church, friends, family members, old schoolmates were quick to defend Merrick's character, describing him as a pillar of the community, a man of unwavering faith, unfairly targeted by hysteria. But beneath that surface, fear simmered. It clawed into everyday life, the sharp looks exchanged at the post office, the way people crossed the street to avoid one another, the palpable tension at school board meetings and town hall gatherings. Neighbors who had once shared coffee and conversation now regarded one another with suspicion, unsure who could be trusted. Parents kept their children close, windows were locked at dusk, and the forests that had once been a playground for generations grew cold and ominous in Black Hollow. Fear has never been a fleeting thing. Here, fear enters, it burrows deep, infects the soil, the trees, the air itself until the weight of it all breaks the surface like something rotten clawing out of the earth. And for Black Hollow, that breaking point came swiftly. By the winter of 1971, with the church shuttered overnight and Reverend Merrick gone without a trace, the fragile facade of normalcy collapsed entirely. But by then, the damage had already been done. The missing were still gone. The symbols still lingered, etched into the bark of ancient oaks. The stories of the Hollow Ones, of private ceremonies, of something ancient and hungry in the hill's head, rooted themselves too deeply to be forgotten. The town might have tried to bury its fears, to smother them beneath denial and folklore, but the earth never forgets. And in places like Black Hollow, the soil keeps its secrets for only so long, before the dead and the truth claw their way back to the surface. March 3rd, 1971. The night Black Hollow's quiet dread finally boiled over into undeniable crisis. The evening began, like so many others in the town, with fog creeping low across the hollows, the forest pressing in close, and the old church standing like a rotting sentinel on the hill. But around midnight, the sheriff's department received the first of several frantic calls. Residents living near the outskirts reported hearing screams, roar, guttural cries echoing down from Black Hollow Church, followed by what one witness described as chanting like nothing human. Sheriff's deputies arrived minutes later, their cruisers cutting through the mist with flashing red and blue lights, the dirt road slick with spring rain. What they expected to find or hoped to avoid remains unclear. Some officers privately admitted later they'd long heard the rumors. The stories of Reverend Merrick's midnight gatherings, the whispers of sacrifices and strange ceremonies. But until that night, they had little reason, or perhaps courage, to act. The reports of screams changed everything. Police footage from that night is grainy, distorted by the primitive technology of the era, but the unease is palpable. Flashlights sweep across the overgrown cemetery, illuminating crumbling headstones and tangled vines. Officers approach the church with caution, weapons drawn, their boots crunching over gravel and wet earth. The structure itself looms out of the fog, warped by time, its stained glass shattered. The front doors weathered but intact. Inside, they expected chaos, perhaps signs of struggle, or the hooded congregants townspeople feared so deeply. Instead, they found silence. The chapel stood empty, the pews warped with age, hymnals scattered across the floor like forgotten relics, faded crosses hung crooked on the walls, the air thick with the smell of mildew and damp wood. But the deputy's flashlights soon revealed something far more disturbing. Along the edges of the altar, beneath the warped floorboards, patches of dirt appeared freshly disturbed, clumps of soil scattered like something had been unearthed or buried. More unsettling still were the markings. Grainy evidence photographs captured them in stark detail: deep gouges, claw-like scrapes along the wooden floor, as though fingernails, or worse, had raked across the planks in panic or violence. Blood, stains, faded but visible, mottled sections of the floor and walls. Not enough to indicate a recent crime, but old enough to suggest something sinister had taken place within these walls, long before the screams of that night ever rang out. Despite the clear signs of disturbance, the church was empty. No Reverend Merrick, no congregation, no trace of the hooded figures or the ceremonies that had fueled years of speculation and dread. The deputies swept the grounds, questioned the few lingering residents brave enough to speak, but answers remained elusive. The only thing they could say for certain was that something had happened inside Black Hollow Church, something the ground itself seemed unwilling to fully reveal. Within days, officials declared the church condemned. Boards were nailed across the doors and windows, warning signs posted, and access strictly prohibited. To the public, it was framed as a response to safety concerns, structural decay, liability issues, standard procedure. But within the tight-lipped circles of Black Hollow, everyone knew better. The church may have been closed, but its shadow remained, heavy and inescapable. Beneath the rotting floorboards, the disturbed earth kept its secrets. The town retreated into silence, but the rumors only deepened. Some claimed Merrick fled that night, vanishing into the hills with his most devout followers. Others whispered he never left, that he, and whatever darkness he worshipped, were buried beneath the church itself. For decades, the building stood abandoned, avoided by most, occasionally vandalized by daring teenagers or curious outsiders, but largely left to decay. The symbols carved into the trees faded with time, the bloodstains darkened and disappeared beneath layers of dust and rot. But the ground beneath, the shallow, disturbed soil under the chapel floor, held on to its truth. And now, with the unearthing of the forgotten mass grave, the soil has finally given up its secrets, forcing Black Hollow to confront what it buried, and what never truly stayed buried at all. Black Hollow's story didn't begin with Reverend Merrick, nor with the crumbling church that now rots on the hilltop. Its roots run far deeper into coal dust, blood, and the whispered legends that have clung to these Appalachian hills for centuries. Long before the first settlers pushed westward, long before mining towns scarred the valleys, this land belonged to the Shawnee and other indigenous peoples who moved through the dense forests and rugged mountains, guided by an ancient understanding of the land and of what lurked beneath it. The Shawnee spoke in hushed tones of the hollow earth, a hidden realm beneath the mountains where shadows dwell, a world of spirits, forgotten ancestors, and entities not entirely bound by the laws of nature. To them, the deep caves and endless hollows of Appalachia were more than geological formations. They were thresholds, gateways to something older, darker, and best left undisturbed. Their stories spoke of places where the earth felt thin, where sounds traveled strangely, and where those who wandered too deep sometimes never returned. When European settlers arrived in the 18th century, they brought their own fears and superstitions, layering them onto the already rich folklore of the region, isolated by rugged terrain and brutal winters. Early homesteaders survived through grit, faith, and a healthy fear of the unknown. The mountains themselves became characters in their stories alive, watching, unpredictable. Strange lights in the woods, ghostly voices on the wind, Unexplained vanishings these were not new to the people of Appalachia. They were inherited warnings, passed down in whispers and folklore. The arrival of the coal industry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries only deepened the region's scars. Towns like Black Hollow sprang up overnight, carved from the mountains, by men desperate for work, their families trailing behind, their lives tethered to the dangerous promise of coal seams. The land was stripped, tunneled, and hollowed out, leaving behind not just environmental devastation but a profound sense of unease. Miners told stories of strange sounds from the deepest shafts, of eerie cave-ins with no clear cause, of tunnels collapsing as if the earth itself was rejecting their intrusion. Those old Appalachian fears evolved alongside industry superstition, survival and secrecy woven into the fabric of life here. Churches sprouted as sanctuaries, but they also became places where fear was repackaged as faith. Black Hollow Church, built in the 1920s at the height of the coal boom, was no different. But even then, whispers followed its stories of the land. Beneath it being cursed, of strange symbols found etched into nearby rocks long before a foundation was ever poured. Folklore texts and faded maps hint at patterns, a recurring unease tethered to specific hollows, valleys, and ridgelines. The Shawnee once avoided these areas. Settlers spoke of them in reverent tones. Coal companies quietly bought up the land, but rarely developed it fully. Across generations, the same uneasy truth remained. Some places in Appalachia feel heavier, darker, charged with the weight of history and something far older than human memory. In Black Hollow, those old superstitions never faded. They seeped into every creaking floorboard, every whispered warning, every boundary the locals still refuse to cross. The church, its rotting timbers and broken windows, stands as a monument to that uneasy Lagosier reminder that here faith, fear, and folklore have always been one and the same. And beneath it all, the hollow earth waits, its secrets buried just below the surface, where the shadows never fully sleep. In the spring of 2024, the quiet dread lingering over Black Hollow finally cracked wide open. It started, as these things often do, by accident. A lone hiker-an outsider, unfamiliar with the town's whispered warnings, ventured too close to the decaying remains of Black Hollow Church. Heavy rains that winter had eroded the hillside, washing away decades of soil. An overgrowth revealing what the town had long tried to forget. Half buried in the mud, tangled in the roots of an ancient oak, the hiker stumbled upon skeletal remains, sun-bleached fragments of bone, brittle but unmistakably human. Authorities were called to the scene within hours. Local deputies off the area, but it quickly became clear this was no ordinary discovery. Forensic teams, crime scene units, and state investigators descended on the crumbling church, setting up tents and equipment beneath the looming shadow of its rotting frame. As the excavation began, the scope of what lay beneath the church floorboards horrified even the most seasoned investigators. What started as the recovery of a few scattered bones turned into something far larger. A sprawling massed grave hidden beneath the chapel's foundation. Skeletal remains emerged layer by layer, unearthed by archaeologists and forensic anthropologists, their gloved hands sifting through soil that had gone undisturbed for decades. Skulls, rib cages, femurs, the bones spoke of dozens of victims, buried hastily without ceremony, their bodies crammed into the shallow earth beneath the church's rotting floor. Crime scene photographs capture the haunting scale of the discovery. Rows of skeletal fragments, bones marked by time, and in some cases by signs of violence, fractured skulls, broken ribs, ligature marks along long-decayed vertebrae. Forensic specialists, their faces grave, began the painstaking process of cataloguing the remains, hoping to piece together a narrative from the fragments left behind. The questions spread faster than the answers. Who were they? Forgotten townsfolk, who vanished without explanation. Victims of foul play, perhaps linked to the long-rumored rituals whispered about Reverend Merrick's congregation, or casualties of something older, darker, woven into the very fabric of Black Hollow's history. Theories circulated with a ferocity the town hadn't seen since the church shuttered in 1971. Local historians combed through archives, unearthing old police reports, missing persons lists, and newspaper clippings long yellowed with age. The timelines aligned disturbingly well. The disappearances that plagued Black Hollow in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the vanished children, the missing young women, the townsfolk who seemingly evaporated into thin air, now had a potential burial site. Anthropologists confirmed that many of the remains dated back at least 50 years, consistent with that period of mounting fear and tension. But more unsettling were the anomaly's bones bearing unusual carvings, symbols etched into the skulls and femurs, matching those long whispered about in Appalachian folklore. Spiral patterns, angular marks, symbols eerily similar to those found carved into trees near the church decades earlier. Theories poured in from every corner. Some insisted the mass grave was the work of Reverend Merrick's inner circle, that the church had in its final days devolved from a house of worship into a cult-like enclave where ritual sacrifice replaced prayer. Others pointed to the town's deep-rooted superstitions, suggesting the victims weren't mere congregants, but participants, or perhaps offerings in ceremonies tied to the Hollow Ones. The secretive figures, long rumored to dwell in the forests, straddling the line between folklore and something far more corporeal. Skeptics dismissed the more extreme theories, positing that the grave was an unfortunate relic of the town's darker past, perhaps linked to poverty, mining accidents, or crimes of desperation and violence hastily concealed beneath the church. Yet even the most pragmatic investigators couldn't ignore the unsettling details. The symbols, the positioning of the bodies, the proximity to the church long associated with secrecy and fear. Interviews with forensic experts reveal a web of possibilities but few certainties. Many of the remains, due to time and exposure, offer limited forensic evidence, no definitive cause of death for most victims, no conclusive DNA matches, only fragments of a story buried for half a century. A few skeletal remains, however, show signs of trauma. Blunt force fractures, defensive wounds, and in some chilling cases, evidence suggesting ritualistic dismemberment. As the excavation continues, the scope only deepens. More bodies are uncovered, pushing the estimated death toll higher. The site, once dismissed as abandoned and irrelevant, has become the epicenter of a renewed investigation, one that stretches beyond Black Hollow, drawing the attention of state authorities, anthropologists, folklore scholars, and even conspiracy theorists. Residents, especially the older generation, watch the unfolding investigation with a mixture of fear and vindication. For decades, they carried the weight of suspicion, their warnings dismissed as paranoia. Now, with bone after bone pulled from the soil beneath Black Hollow Church, their fears are cemented in grim reality. But answers remain elusive. Reverend Merrick's fate is still a mystery. His most loyal followers vanished alongside him. And the true nature of what happened beneath that church, whether born of cultic devotion, ancient superstition, or something more sinister, remains buried beneath layers of secrecy and time. In Black Hollow, the ground has finally given up its dead. But the truth that may still lie deeper, hidden beneath generations of fear, silence, and shadows. In the months following the discovery beneath Black Hollow Church, the quiet Appalachian town found itself thrust into an unwanted spotlight, its name splashed across headlines, true crime podcasts, and late-night news segments. But as investigators struggled to piece together the grim puzzle of the mass grave, a different storm brewed online, a relentless wave of speculation, misinformation, and conspiracy theories that threatened to bury the truth beneath layers of distortion. Social media platforms exploded with theories almost overnight. Grainy images of the excavation site circulated across Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube, accompanied by ominous music and captions warning of hidden cults and secret societies operating in plain sight. Hashtags like #BlackHollowTruth, #HollowOnes, and #Merrick trended within days. Internet sleuths, amateur historians, and conspiracy enthusiasts flooded forums and comment sections, each offering their version of the story, each more sensational than the last. Some blamed Reverend Elijah Merrick entirely, branding him as the leader of a fanatical death cult that preyed on vulnerable townsfolk under the guise of faith. They pointed to the old missing persons posters, the whispered stories of midnight rituals, the eerie symbols carved into the bones as irrefutable proof of ritual sacrifice. For these theorists, Merrick wasn't just a misguided preacher, he was the orchestrator of an occult network that spanned decades, maybe even generations. Others took a different, more conspiratorial path. They claimed the mass grave wasn't the work of a church or cult at all, but part of a broader cover-up, a hidden chapter in a long-running government experiment buried deep within the forgotten corners of Appalachia. Posts speculated that Black Hollow had been a testing ground for mind control programs, biological experiments, or clandestine military operations. Old, grainy photographs of helicopters flying over the region or faded newspaper reports of military presence were dragged up as evidence. Some even suggested that the bones beneath the church weren't entirely human, connecting the discovery to fringe theories about subterranean creatures or hollow earth beings long tied to Appalachian folklore. Fueling the fire, local media, outlets and national networks struggled to separate fact from speculation. Early reports were riddled with inaccuracies, misstated victim counts, sensationalized claims of satanic rituals, and quotes taken out of context from terrified residents. As corrections trickled in, the damage was already done. Misinformation spreads faster than truth, and in Black Hollow, rumors have always carried more weight than facts. The resurgence of satanic panic rhetoric further complicated matters. Older residents recalled the fear-driven hysteria of the 1980s, when tales of hidden cults and ritual abuse swept across America, often without evidence. Now, with genuine remains unearthed beneath the church, the lines between folklore, fear, and reality blurred beyond recognition. Social media fanned the flames, amplifying the most extreme voices while silencing those pleading for caution and clarity. Anonymous accounts claimed to have insider knowledge, leaking supposed police documents, or grainy, doctored photographs of hooded figures in the woods. Conspiracy forums dissected every symbol, every bone fragment, every offhand comment from investigators, weaving them into elaborate narratives impossible to verify but hard to ignore. Some accused the current authorities of the sheriff's department was either covering up the truth or hopelessly out of its depth. Others pointed fingers at state officials, federal agencies, even local families long tied to the town's power structures. Caught in the maelstrom were the actual investigators, forensic teams, and anthropologists working tirelessly to analyze the remains, untangle timelines, and offer scientific answers. But their cautious, methodical approach couldn't compete with the internet's hunger for immediate, shocking revelations. For the people of Black Hollow, the digital chaos reignited old tensions. Families who had quietly borne the stigma of Merrick's congregation now found themselves targets of online harassment. Outsiders flooded the town, some chasing viral fame, others genuinely seeking answers, but most only adding to the confusion. Property was vandalized, old graves disturbed, and the town's fragile peace shattered once again in the fog of conflicting accounts. One truth remained clear. In Black Hollow, rumors have always been deadlier than facts. They spread like wildfire through the hollows, filling the silence left by unanswered questions. And as history has shown, when fear takes root in these mountains, it festers, twisting reality, obscuring truth, and ensuring that some secrets remain buried far longer than the bones beneath the church floor. For decades, the silence surrounding Black Hollow Church was absolute. Those who had lived through the town's darkest years either vanished, kept quiet, or carried their secrets like scars. But in the wake of the 2024 discovery, the unearthing of dozens of bodies, hidden beneath the church's rotting floorboards, the silence began to fracture. Slowly, cautiously, people started to speak. Hidden witnesses, former congregants, and townsfolk who had buried their stories in fear and shame began to surface. Their testimonies illuminating fragments of a history long clouded by rumor and denial. In dimly lit interviews, their identities concealed. Voices distorted to protect them from old enemies or, perhaps, from the town itself. Former members of Reverend Elijah Merrick's inner circle recounted chilling details. They spoke of secret ceremonies held behind the church's locked doors, gatherings that extended well beyond ordinary worship. Congregants were required to pledge absolute loyalty, expected to participate in rituals few understood but all feared. The testimonies described cryptic chants, sung in ancient guttural tones, their meanings never fully explained. Participants stood in circles, robed in darkness. As Merrick delivered sermons that veered into something far removed from scripture messages about transcendence, sacrifice, and the hollow beneath the earth. Multiple accounts confirmed rumors of a locked basement beneath Black Hollow Church, a place off limits to all but Merrick's most trusted followers. Those permitted inside recalled it as a suffocating, windowless space, stone walls etched with symbols, eerily similar to those later found carved into the bones recovered from the mass grave. Some described the faint but unmistakable presence of something else, unseen figures moving in the shadows, voices whispering from beyond the walls. Whether those recollections stemmed from memory, suggestion, or something darker remains impossible to prove. But even as these hidden witnesses stepped forward, their accounts were fragmented, riddled with contradictions. Memories faltered under the weight of time, fear, and trauma. Some survivors insisted the ceremonies were purely symbolic, frightening, yes, but not physically violent. Others claimed to have witnessed unspeakable acts in the church's basement, involving blood, disappearances, and sacrifices disguised as spiritual transcendence. The truth, like so much in Black Hollow, remains buried beneath layers of secrecy and fear, declassified files, unearthed from dusty archives and long-forgotten police reports, lend credibility to parts of these stories. Records from the late 1960s document repeated calls to authorities about disturbances at the church and unexplained lights, chanting, strange figures seen near the forest's edge. Yet time after time, investigations fizzled, reports vanished, and those brave enough to speak found themselves silenced, their warnings dismissed as hysteria or mountain folklore. Now, those overlooked testimonies have resurfaced, casting old events in a new, chilling light. Survivors, many now aging, their faces lined with regret recount the subtle but deliberate manipulation Reverend Merrick wielded over his congregation. They describe a leader who exuded unwavering authority, whose charisma masked something darker. Merrick preached salvation, but only through submission to forces most dared not name. And while human memory is fragile, the earth itself forgets nothing. The dead beneath Black Hollow Church have told their own story, bones etched with symbols, fractured by violence, buried in shallow graves beneath the altar of supposed salvation. Their remains corroborate fragments of the hidden witnesses' accounts, aligning timelines, reviving fears, and exposing the gaps between folklore and fact. But even as these testimonies emerge, fear lingers like a shadow over Black Hollow. Some who speak do so in whispers, their identities guarded, terrified that the past isn't as distant as they once hoped. Others refuse to talk entirely, carrying their knowledge to the grave, convinced that the dangers buried beneath the church never truly disappeared. The puzzle remains incomplete. Testimonies, both new and old, clash with distorted rumors and conflicting theories, but each fragment, every whispered confession, pulls the story of Black Hollow closer to the surface, reminding the town and the world beyond that silence is never truly empty. In the end, the dead will always find a way to speak. The excavation beneath Black Hollow Church revealed more than just bones. It exposed chilling fragments of a forgotten nightmare etched into the very remains themselves. As forensic teams sifted through the mass grave, cataloguing skulls, vertebrae, and fragments of bone, they began to uncover patterns that defied simple explanation. Symbols, deliberate, unsettling, carved directly into the bones, their edges worn but unmistakably human in their precision. Spirals, jagged lines, and angular markings circled femurs, rib cages, even fragments of skulls. These were not the chaotic scrapes of time or decayed. They were etched with purpose, their placement calculated to dismiss as coincidence. The symbols did not match any known religious doctrine. They were neither Christian nor tied to regional Appalachian traditions, nor associated with indigenous carvings familiar to the area. Anthropologists, historians, and symbologists were called in, their expertise drawn from decades of studying forgotten languages, ancient belief systems, and obscure cult iconography. Yet even among the most seasoned experts, consensus proved elusive. The markings shared eerie similarities with those long whispered about in Appalachian folklore, symbols tied to the Hollow Ones, figures of myth who, according to generations of stories, lived hidden beneath the mountains, bound to ancient forces that predated settlers, industry, even the land's recorded history. But beyond folklore, the symbols remained largely undocumented, surfacing only in fragments passed down through oral tradition. Warnings carved into trees, scrawled onto barns, etched into the soil near old mining camps. Forensic analysis revealed The carvings were made post-mortem but shortly after death, indicating deliberate ritual rather than natural erosion. Tool markings suggested sharp, primitive instruments were used, possibly knives, chisels, or sharpened bone fragments themselves. The precision with which the symbols were applied unnerved investigators. Even after decades underground, the etched lines held their form, a testament to the ritual's significance to those who performed it. Amidst the bones, other artifacts surfaced, charred remnants of what appeared to be ceremonial objects, candle holders, fragments of pottery bearing similar spiral motifs, and rusted chains partially embedded in the soil. Tests revealed traces of organic material, dried blood, animal remains, and compounds associated with fire-based rituals. Together, these clues painted a grim picture. This was no simple burial ground, nor the chaotic aftermath of violence. It was a deliberate site of ceremony, orchestrated with care, concealed beneath the church's decaying floorboards for over half a century. The deeper investigators probed, the stranger the evidence became. Some bones exhibited signs of ritualistic breakage, fractures at precise points, suggesting ceremonial rather than accidental damage. Skulls bore symbols carved in concentric circles around the eye sockets. Ribs were etched along the inner curvature, as if marking the remains from the inside out. Two seasoned forensic anthropologists, the implications were staggering. This was evidence of ritual behavior, entirely undocumented within conventional religious, cultural, or historical frameworks. Among the unearthed remains, one discovery stood: a parter, small, weathered talisman carved from bone, bearing the same cryptic spirals and jagged lines found on the skeletons. Experts dated it to at least the mid-20th century, aligning with the period of Reverend Merrick's influence and the wave of disappearances that plagued Black Hollow. The talisman, though simple in form, carried the same deliberate, unsettling craftsmanship that marked the mass gravet's presence, a tangible link between the folklore, the church, and the chilling reality buried beneath. Interviews with cultural historians revealed disturbing parallels. While no official records documented these symbols, obscure references surfaced in regional legends, the Hollow Ones. The idea of subterranean beings, ancient rituals tied to the earth itself. Some accounts spoke of sacrifices made to appease the depths, offerings buried to prevent the awakening of something far older than the town. Until now, such stories were dismissed as folklore, whispered warnings designed to scare children away from the forests. But the evidence beneath Black Hollow Church suggested otherwise: proof, not of mere superstition, but of ritual practices hidden in plain sight, concealed beneath layers of secrecy and decaying faith. The unearthed symbols, the bone markings, the ceremonial artifacts, they forced investigators to confront the possibility that Black Hollow's darkest fears were rooted not in myth, but in history deliberately erased. Each piece of evidence spoke of ceremony, but whether those ceremonies were acts of worship, protection, or something darker, no one could yet say. For the residents of Black Hollow, the revelations were as terrifying as they were validating. The rumors, the disappearances, the whispered warnings, they had all led to this moment, when bones carved with ancient, unnerving symbols finally surfaced to tell their own story. Yet, even with the evidence laid bare, the true meaning of those markings, the purpose behind the rituals, the identity of those buried beneath, the church remained obscured, buried beneath decades of silence, secrecy, and fear. The dead may have been hidden far too long, but now they speak through the chilling details left behind, and their story is only beginning to surface. As forensic teams and cultural historians delved deeper into the evidence unearthed from beneath Black Hollow Church, a chilling thread began to emerge, a tapestry of symbols, rituals, and cryptic messages connecting decades of whispered folklore to tangible, disturbing reality. At the heart of this mystery lay the markings carved into bone, scrawled onto recovered artifacts, and hidden within decaying texture, cryptic language that blended familiar Appalachian folk traditions with something far older and far less understood. Experts quickly noted the visual similarities between the symbols found on the skeletal remains and traditional Appalachian hex signs, a form of folk art with deep roots in the region, commonly painted on barns or carved into wood for protection, good fortune, or fertility. But these markings diverged sharply from the colorful, symmetrical patterns associated with hex signs meant to ward off evil. The symbols recovered from Black Hollow were jagged, asymmetrical, carved with harsh, angular lines that carried an unmistakable undertone of menace. They seemed less like a shield and more like an invitation. Linguists and folklorists pored over the fragments, tracing the motifs across centuries of mountain lore. Some recognized twisted variations of protection symbols, pentacles, spirals, sunbursts distorted almost beyond recognition. Others spotted markings associated with fertility and harvest rituals, warped into ominous patterns etched into the bones of the dead. It raised a disturbing question. Were these symbols remnants of Appalachian traditions, corrupted over time, or did they predate the settlers entirely? Buried among the artifacts, investigators uncovered faded pages from hand-copied texts, their margins adorned with crude versions of the same symbols. One recurring phrase, scrawled in archaic English and barely legible, sent a fresh ripple of fear through the investigative teams. Asterisk, the hollowing comes. The hollowing comes. Asterisk, the phrase appeared repeatedly, sometimes paired with depictions of figures vanishing into the earth or skeletal hands clawing upward from below. Scholars speculated about the meaning, some interpreting it as a warning, others as a prophecy of transformation, perhaps even a ritualistic purge designed to cleanse the community through sacrifice. But beyond translation, one truth lingered. No one could agree on whether the hollowing symbolized destruction or awakening. The idea of the hollowing echoed old Appalachian superstitions, the belief that beneath the mountains lay a hidden world, a subterranean realm where shadows gathered, where those who crossed certain thresholds were never seen again. Folklore spoke of thin places in the land cracks where the barrier between the living and the forgotten frayed, and rituals were performed to appease or invite whatever lurked beneath. Could the carvings on the bones, the spirals, jagged lines, concentric circles have been attempts to communicate with, or even summon, forces hidden within the hollow earth? Or were they desperate warnings, left by those who understood the consequences too late? Recovered talismans, adorned with matching symbols, suggested ritualistic intent. Some resembled traditional charms meant to guard against Others depicted distorted human faces, skull-like and hollow-eyed, their mouths open as if in eternal, silent screams. Interpreters speculated they represented those taken by the hollowing, or perhaps those returned, irrevocably changed. The symbolism stretched beyond art and language. Investigators discovered ceremonial arrangements within the burial site, positioning of bodies, the patterns of artifacts, the alignment of carved symbols, all adhering to a hidden logic only partially understood. Some bones were stacked in spirals, others arranged in rough circles, echoing the same geometric forms found in both the symbols and Old Appalachian Protective SIG/ILS. As scholars pieced together these unsettling fragments, one realization took root: whether the rituals were meant to protect the town, or to awaken something far older and darker, the line between folklore and reality had long since dissolved. Black Hollow's secrets were not born of myth alone. They were etched in bone, buried in soil, and woven into a language that remained, even now, dangerously incomplete, and with the mass grave exposed, the symbols revealed, and the hollowing invoked once again, the question remains: what, exactly, did they invite, and is it still waiting? In the aftermath of the Black Hollow Church discovery, the bones, symbols, and chilling artifacts painted only part of the picture. To understand how an entire congregation, and by extension, an entire town became entangled in secrecy, rituals, and possible tragedy, one must look beyond the physical evidence and into the human mind. Experts in psychology, cult behavior, and trauma recovery have stepped in to dissect how beliefs, so often a source of comfort, can mutate into control, manipulation, and, in the most harrowing cases, collective delusion. Cult deprogrammers, forensic psychologists, and sociologists, interviewed under the shadow of these Appalachian hills, agree on one critical point: Black Hollow was a textbook example of how fear, isolation, and charismatic leadership can converge into something far more dangerous than simple superstition. Dr. Alina Rhodes, a forensic psychologist specializing in closed communities and coercive control, describes the mechanisms that often lead vulnerable groups down such dark paths. When you combine geographic isolation, generational poverty, and a history steeped in folklore and distrust of outsiders, it creates fertile ground for charismatic figures to rise unchecked, Rhodes explains. In these environments, fear isn't abstract, it's part of daily survival. Fear of economic collapse, fear of illness, fear of the other. It primes people to seek safety in strong, often authoritarian leadership. In Black Hollow, that leader was Reverend Elijah Merrick. To the outside world, he was a man of faith, shepherding his congregation through hard times. But according to survivor testimonies and expert analysis, Merrick's influence extended far beyond sermons. His teachings, described by former congregants as intense and secretive, incorporated a dangerous blend of distorted scripture, Appalachian superstition, and esoteric rituals that blurred the line between faith and fear. Dr. Rhodes notes that Merrick's strategy followed a classic pattern seen in high-control groups: isolation, indoctrination, and the gradual dismantling of critical thinking. He redefined the source of fear, she says. No longer was it poverty or sickness. The fear became spiritual, unseen, existential, and only he could offer protection. Cult deprogrammers, familiar with the case, highlight the chilling psychological grip Merrick exerted over his followers. Former members described mandatory late-night ceremonies, the use of cryptic chants, and constant reinforcement of the idea that the world outside Black Hollow was corrupt, dangerous, and unworthy of trust. It's a slow process, explains Michael Vega, a deprogrammer with decades of experience rescuing individuals from destructive groups. They isolate you socially, they control the information you receive, and they feed you a narrative so repeatedly that eventually you stop questioning. You internalize the fear and their supposed solution becomes your only reality. In Black Hollow, belief itself became bondage. The congregation's faith, once rooted in traditional religious practices, was deliberately reshaped into something rigid, secretive, and wholly dependent on Merrick's interpretation of events. Survivors recount how ordinary rituals evolved into ceremonies heavy with ominous symbolism. Prayers became incantations. Bible studies blurred with folklore lessons on the hollow ones, and the ancient entities believed to dwell beneath the earth. Experts emphasize the psychological toll such environments impose, particularly when children are involved. Developmental. Psychologists point to the long-term trauma suffered by those raised under these conditions. Fear replaces curiosity, conformity replaces identity, and critical thinking is actively discouraged. In Black Hollow, missing persons reports particularly involving young congregants fueled suspicions that this psychological control may have escalated. Beyond mere manipulation, brain scans and psychological studies of cult survivors reveal patterns consistent with high levels of chronic stress, anxiety, and PTSD. Neural pathways associated with fear response become overactive, while critical reasoning centers show signs of diminished engagement. In essence, prolonged exposure to fear-based belief systems can physically rewire the brain, making escape, or even independent thought, extraordinarily difficult. Survivor accounts from Black Hollow reflect these realities. Those who managed to break free describe feelings of disassociation, persistent nightmares, and a fractured sense of reality. Many remained silent for years, their memories clouded by trauma, guilt, and the lingering influence of indoctrination. Some admitted they still struggle to distinguish between the folklore-fed fears instilled by Merrick and the rational truths they've since tried to embrace. Dr. Rhodes underscores the tragedy of such psychological entrapment. These individuals didn't choose darkness, they were led there, step by step, through systematic manipulation. Fear was weaponized, belief was twisted, and over time, their world shrank to the walls of that church, and the whispers of what waited beneath it. For the broader community of Black Hollow, the psychological consequences echo beyond Merrick's inner circle. Generational fear, compounded by economic hardship and geographic isolation, left the town vulnerable to cycles of paranoia, rumor, and mistrust. Even now, with the mass grave exposed and experts dissecting the evidence, many residents remain reluctant to speak, their silence a product of years conditioned to fear reprisal, judgment, or the resurfacing of old traumas. The experts agree. Breaking such cycles is possible, but it requires transparency, education, and long-term psychological supports, something Black Hollow, like many rural, isolated communities, has historically lacked without intervention. The scars left by Merrick's manipulation and the terrifying events tied to that church may persist in both mind and memory, long after the last bone is unearthed. In the end, Black Hollow's tragedy isn't just etched in symbols or buried in shallow graves, it's embedded in the human psyche. A chilling reminder of how belief, when distorted by fear and controlled by those hungry for power, can become the most unshakable form of bondage. The story of Black Hollow, hidden beneath decades of silence and fear, begins to take shape when the events are stripped from rumor and laid bare on a timeline that reveals chilling patterns long overlooked. From 1959 to 1971, a series of disappearances, strange gatherings, and cryptic symbols converged around one central figure, the enigmatic Reverend Elijah Merricand. The decaying structure that was once Black Hollow Church. It began quietly. In the fall of 1959, when the town of Black Hollow was already in decline. The coal mines that built the town were drying up, families were leaving, and those who stayed clung to faith and folklore for survival. That year, Reverend Merrick arrived, a charismatic preacher whose sermons drew not just the curious, but the desperate. His message blended fire and brimstone warnings with cryptic references to Appalachian legends, the hollow earth, the unseen shadows beneath the mountains, and the idea that salvation required more than prayer. By 1960, the church's congregation had swelled, though not without raising suspicion. Locals reported Merrick's sermons growing more secretive, often held behind locked doors. Evening gatherings became common services stretching past midnight, the faint glow of candlelight flickering behind stained glass, and strange hymns carried on the wind. The first disappearance came in the spring of 1961. 7-year-old Alice Carter vanished walking home from choir practice. Official searches turned up nothing, and whispers of her fate quickly splintered the town. Her family, devout members of the church, remained silent, fueling suspicions. Between 1961 and 1965, 4 more residents disappeared under equally mysterious circumstances. Matthew Griggs, age 10, was last seen outside Sunday school in 1962. By 1964, 2 young women vanished within weeks of each other, both active congregants at Merrick's church. Publicly, authorities blamed runaways or transient crime, but unofficially, the town's fear deepened. In 1965, symbols began appearing etched into trees, carved into rocks near the church, even scrawled in chalk on sidewalks. Spirals, jagged lines, and angular marks, unfamiliar to most, though eerily similar to those found later on the unearthed bones. That same year, old-timers spoke of hearing chanting deep in the woods, strange gatherings beneath moonless skies, and the growing sense that the land itself was restless. By 1967, sheriff's deputies logged repeated reports of disturbances near Black Hollow Church. Witnesses described bonfires beyond the tree line, hooded figures disappearing into the forest, and mutilated animals left near property lines. Yet, despite mounting evidence, no arrests were made. Merrick's followers remained fiercely loyal, dismissing accusations as paranoia and mountain superstition. The disappearances continued, though they became harder to track. Some families refused to report missing loved ones, fearing retaliation or humiliation. By 1970, at least 15 townspeople had vanished without trace, the pattern impossible to ignore. The church, once a symbol of faith, loomed like a decaying relic over a town now divided by fear. The turning point came on March 3, 1971. Sheriff's deputies, responding to reports of screams and flickering lights, raided Black Hollow Church. Inside, they found an empty sanctuary, the air heavy with incense and smoke. The floorboards were freshly disturbed, claw marks etched into the walls, and faded bloodstains smeared beneath the altar. No arrests followed, no one willing to testify, no bodies uncovered, but the church was shuttered overnight. Reverend Merrick vanished, along with several core members of his congregation. The town fell silent. Officially, the church's closure was blamed on dwindling attendance and economic decline. Unofficially, the people of Black Hollow buried the fear, the missing, and the memories beneath layers of silence and survival. For decades, the structure decayed, its rotting frame left to the elements, its history avoided in conversation. But the timeline, reconstructed through careful investigation, reveals a pattern that can no longer be ignored, one of growing secrecy, escalating disappearances, ritual symbolism, and a final act of abandonment that concealed the truth beneath. The floorboards, and now, with the 2024 discovery of the mass grave beneath Black Hollow Church, The chilling chronology of those years is clear. Between 1959 and 1971, something far darker than faith took root in Black Hollow. The symbols, the rituals, the disappearances, all converged in a web of fear and manipulation, culminating in the church's closure and the decades of silence that followed. The timeline is no longer fragmented whispers or speculation. It is a clear, unsettling portrait of how belief, secrecy, and fear spiraled into tragedy beneath the Appalachian hills, its echoes still resonating, its unanswered questions still buried in the earth today. Black Hollow mourns, but beneath the quiet memorial vigils and the flickering candles left at the church ruins, a deeper unease lingers. The mass grave beneath Black Hollow Church has been unearthed, yet the names remain unknown, the stories untold, and the darkness surrounding it largely undisturbed. For the residents of this forgotten Appalachian town, the discovery has reopened wounds that never truly healed old fears, buried traumas, and the suffocating silence that has hovered over these hills since the church doors were boarded shut in 1971. In the weeks following the excavation, forensic teams have worked tirelessly, cataloging remains, analyzing artifacts, and sifting through decades of soil layered with decay and secrecy. But progress comes slowly, and with each unearthed bone or etched symbol, new questions replace old ones. Who were they, the people buried beneath the rotting floorboards? Were they lost townsfolk, hidden victims of ritual, or sacrifices to beliefs no one dares name aloud? And where is Reverend Elijah Merrick, the man at the center of it all, his fate as elusive now as it was the night he vanished? Memorials have sprung up across the town, modest gatherings of grieving families, aging residents, and curious outsiders. Flowers left at the church gate wilt beneath the creeping vines that overtake the structure. Candles flicker in the windows of nearby homes, casting faint light against the oppressive fog that never quite lifts from Black Hollow's hills. Yet, for many, the mourning feels incomplete. How do you grieve the unknown? How do you find closure when the grave holds no names, only questions carved into bone? Law enforcement officials have been cautious, their statements measured. They confirm the mass grave, the symbols, the human remains, but avoid speculation, wary of fueling the already rampant theories spiraling across media outlets and internet forums. The official stance remains one of careful investigation, but privately, many admit the unsettling reality. Much of Black Hollow's past remains deliberately obscured, sealed behind decades of silence and fear. Survivors of Merrick's congregations, who have cautiously stepped forward or fragmented memories, their testimonies clouded by trauma, coercion, and the erosion of time. They speak of ceremonies cloaked in secrecy, of rituals that blended Appalachian folklore with distorted doctrine, of chants, warning of the hollowing, a phrase still left without clear meaning. But even their confessions raise more doubts than answers. How much is memory? How much is fear reshaping recollection? And how much truth remains buried, both in soil and in mind? The community itself teeters between mourning and denial. For some, the discovery is validation, the confirmation of long-whispered suspicions about Merrick, the church, and the darkness festering beneath Black Hollow. For others, it is an unwelcome disruption, a reopening of a chapter they had chosen to forget, or at least pretend never happened. Old divides resurface, as fear once again festers beneath the town's fragile surface, and still the forest looms. The same mist-draped woods that once carried the echoes of strange hymns and flickering bonfires now stand silent, heavy with an oppressive quiet. Some say the woods remember that even after the church's closure, the shadows never fully receded, only retreated, biding their time beneath the canopy of twisted branches and forgotten trails. Locals report hearing faint chanting on sleepless nights, glimpsing strange symbols scratched into tree bark deep in the hollows, finding small, unsettling arrangements of stones near abandoned paths. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps the lingering residue of an unspoken past, but in Black Hollow, the lines between myth and memory blur to icily dot as investigators continue their work. The haunting reality persists. The mass grave is only part of the story, a physical remnant of something more elusive, a legacy of secrecy, manipulation, and belief corrupted into fear. The bones tell fragments, the symbols hint at forgotten rituals. But the full truth, the motivations, the victims, the role of the church and its enigmatic leader remains obscured, distorted by silence and the weight of decades-long denial. Black Hollow mourns, but it mourns in fragments. Candles gutter out, flowers wither, and beneath the vigil's solemn quiet, the same unanswered questions settle like ash across the town. Who lies beneath the church? What happened during those moonless nights filled with chanting and fire? Did the darkness die with Merrick's disappearance, or does it still coil beneath the earth, restless, waiting? For now, answers evade. The names remain unknown, the stories untold, and the forest, like the town, keeps its silence. Some graves should never be forgotten, but in Black Hollow, remembrance comes wrapped in fear, and the shadows whisper still, undisturbed beneath the weight of soil, secrecy, and time, as investigators, historians, and experts sift through the fractured remains of Black Hollow's dark legacy. The same unsettling questions persist, clawing their way back to the surface, no matter how deep the town tries to bury them. The mass grave beneath the church, the etched symbols on bone, the disappearances, all these threads refuse to unravel into a single, neat conclusion. Instead, they splinter into competing theories, each offering its own bleak interpretation, none capable of fully silencing the questions that now haunt Black Hollow. West Virginia, the most conventional theory, supported by forensic evidence and survivor testimonies, frames the tragedy as a case of cultic manipulation turned deadly. Reverend Elijah Merrick, whose charismatic presence arrived in Black Hollow in 1959, is viewed by many experts as a textbook example of authoritarian religious leadership spiraling into fanaticism. His sermons, laden with cryptic warnings and folklore references, systematically isolated his congregation from the outside world. Former members have spoken, though cautiously, of private ceremonies, locked basements, and rituals that blurred the lines between faith and fear. Proponents of this theory argue that Merrick's doctrine, heavily steeped in Appalachian superstition, mutated into something far more dangerous, a closed community primed for manipulation, convinced of an existential threat hidden beneath the earth, and willing to make sacrifices, literal or symbolic, to protect themselves. The timeline supports this narrative. The surge in disappearances, the escalation of secret gatherings, and the eventual shuttering of the church all align with patterns seen in other high-control groups. But even within this lens of cult psychology, the evidence refuses to rest quietly. The symbols carved into bone, the ceremonial arrangement of remains, and the archaic language recovered from artifacts phrases like "the hollowing comes," push the theory beyond the realm of typical cult behavior. Experts in anthropology and religious studies Note that the markings do not align with known occult or religious systems, suggesting either the invention of a new belief system or, more disturbingly, the revival of something far older. This possibility fractures the investigation further, giving rise to a second dominant theory that the mass grave and rituals are connected to an ancient, region-specific belief system predating the Church entirely. Appalachian historians and folklorists have long documented whispered tales of the Hollow Ones, entities said to dwell beneath the mountains, capable of influencing or even consuming those who trespass too close to hidden thresholds. Symbols eerily similar to those found etched into the bones have surfaced in obscure corners of regional history. On trees near forgotten mining camps, scratched into stone markers along remote trails, or passed down through generations as cryptic warnings. Could Reverend Merrick have tapped into this forgotten folklore? Or did he genuinely believe in a force older than organized religions, something buried beneath the Appalachian hills, demanding reverence, sacrifice, or both? Some argue Merrick wasn't the originator, but merely the latest in a long, hidden tradition of appeasement rituals tied to the land's ancient superstitions. Others see this theory as little more than mythology seeping into the gaps left by incomplete evidence. A third, more speculative theory connects Black Hollow's tragedy to clandestine government operations. As the investigation gained national attention, conspiracy forums resurrected claims of secret experiments buried in Appalachian history. Some point to declassified documents detailing Cold War-era psychological operations and covert experiments conducted in remote, economically depressed communities across the United States. Black Hollow, with its isolation, poverty, and generational distrust of outsiders, would have been a prime, overlooked testing ground. Proponents of this theory argue that the symbols, disappearances, and psychological manipulation within the Church could have been the byproduct of classified mind control experiments, a modern twist on old folklore, designed to fracture a community's sense of reality. While this theory is the most sensational, experts caution against dismissing it entirely, citing known historical programs like M-Culture that targeted vulnerable populations under the guise of scientific research. Yet, no direct evidence, circumstantial patterns connects Black Hollow to these operations. The most esoteric theory refuses to confine itself to psychology, folklore, or clandestine human activity. It suggests that the truth buried beneath Black Hollow Church is not merely symbolic, but literal, that beneath the Appalachian earth exists something ancient, unknown, and still restless. This interpretation draws on centuries of regional mythology, indigenous oral histories, and the chilling consistency of the phrase, "the hollowing," comes scrawled across recovered artifacts. In this view, the carvings on the bones, the ceremonies, and even the disappearances are seen as desperate acts to contain, appease, or perhaps awaken an entity or force buried deep within the earth. Geologists familiar with the region confirm the vast network of natural caves, abandoned mines, and unexplored underground chambers snaking beneath Black Hollow spaces large, enough to fuel generations of speculation about hidden realms and subterranean presences. While most dismiss these ideas as fear-fed folklore, the eerie consistency of symbols, the mass graves' precise arrangement, and the decades-long silence surrounding the church keep this possibility lingering, if only in the corners of collective anxiety. Each theory-cult manipulation, ancient tradition, covert experimentation, or primordial force competes for dominance. None provide definitive closure. The discovery of the mass grave has answered only the most immediate, physical question: Bodies buried, lives lost, rituals performed. But the deeper truths why they were sacrificed, what Merrick truly believed, whether something more ancient stirred beneath those rotting floorboards remain obscured. Fragmented across survivor accounts, hidden records, and bones etched with symbols no one has fully deciphered. The experts assembled around this case, psychologists, folklorists, forensic investigators, and historians, continue to debate, their voices competing over the board of clues that refuses to resolve into clarity. Some insist that tragedy is entirely human, an origin born of control, manipulation, and fear exploited by a charismatic leader. Others argue the darkness stretches beyond psychology, rooted in Appalachian soil and myth far older than Merrick's sermons. And still, some suggest that truth intertwines both a blend of ancient fear and modern exploitation, spiraling into the tragedy now unearthed beneath the church. What remains indisputable is this: Black Hollow's story is unfinished. The dead have spoken through symbols and fractures, but their final testimony remains buried restless, waiting beneath Appalachian soil. Until all the missing answers rise to the surface, the truth, much like the bones themselves, refuses to stay silent. The horror unearthed beneath Black Hollow Church is not isolated, nor is it unique to the shadowed hills of Appalachia. Across the globe, similar patterns of secrecy, faith twisted into fear, and communities shattered by the collision of belief and manipulation have emerged, leaving behind graves, unanswered questions, and scars that stretch across borders. The forgotten mass grave beneath Black Hollow is, disturbingly, part of a global mosaic, a dark reflection of how humanity's need for meaning, protection, and salvation can be weaponized with devastating consequences. The echoes begin with Jonestown, Guyana, 1978. Over 900 members of the People's Temple, led by the self-proclaimed prophet Jim Jones, perished in what remains one of the deadliest cult-related tragedies in modern history. Like Black Hollow, Jonestown was built on isolation, charismatic leadership, and an escalating atmosphere of paranoia. Survivors and investigators have long drawn parallels between the indoctrination tactics of Jones and those used by Reverend Elijah Merrick's sermons laced with fear. The creation of an us versus them narrative, and the transformation of faith into absolute obedience. Where Black Hollow's dead were buried beneath floorboards, Jonestown's victims lay sprawled across jungle soil, their final moments marked by fear, confusion, and the promise of false salvation. In the deserts of northern Mexico, 1989, the cult surfaced a brutal convergence of crime, ritual, and superstition. Known as Los Narcosatanicos, the cult operated under the leadership of Adolfo Constanzo, blending cartel violence with dark religious ceremonies involving human sacrifice. Authorities uncovered mass graves containing mutilated bodies, many bearing signs of ritualistic torture eerily reminiscent of the bone carvings found beneath Black Hollow Church. Though worlds apart geographically, both cases share unnerving similarities. Isolated communities, esoteric belief systems corrupted for power, and the dead left as evidence of manipulation spiraling into atrocity. Further east, in Uganda, the year 2000 brought the grim discovery of hundreds of bodies linked to the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God. This doomsday cult, driven by apocalyptic prophecies and strict religious dogma, orchestrated mass poisonings and fires, resulting in the deaths of over 700 people. Much like Black Hollow, The Ugandan tragedy was rooted in distorted scripture, fear-driven obedience, and the promise of protection from an approaching calamity, a narrative that ultimately delivered only death. Europe holds its own reflections of this haunting pattern. The solar temple, operating across Switzerland, France, and Canada in the 1990s, left behind multiple mass graves after orchestrated murder-suicides believed to be rituals of spiritual transcendence. Like Black Hollow's mysterious symbols and references to the hollowing, the solar temple's belief system invoked esoteric language, apocalyptic imagery, and an obsession with hidden knowledge, creating an insular world where doubt was silenced and obedience became fatal. Even isolated cases, though smaller in scale, mirror Black Hollow's chilling themes. In rural Australia, the 1990s saw the family cult exposed, a group blending New Age beliefs with authoritarian control, responsible for abductions, child abuse, and hidden graves. Appalachian Hills, Australian bushland, African jungles, the landscapes change, but the undercurrent remains. Isolated communities, charismatic leaders, the manipulation of fear, and the inevitable unearthing of graves that testify to how easily belief can descend into horror. Beyond these prominent cases, archaeologists and human rights investigators continue to uncover forgotten mass graves, worldwide remnants of war, ethnic cleansing, state-sanctioned atrocities, and cultic violence. In each discovery, the same unsettling elements persist: secrecy, systemic control, and rituals, whether spiritual, political, or both, used to justify the unimaginable. From Cambodia's killing fields to Argentina's disappeared of the dirty war, graves hidden beneath soil, floorboards, or forests speak to a universal truth. When ideology, be it faith, politics, or prophecy, merges with unchecked power, human lives are too often the currency of control. Experts studying Black Hollow caution against viewing its mass grave as an isolated Appalachian tragedy. Instead, they frame it as a localized manifestation of a global, timeless pattern, the collision of belief and vulnerability exploited by those who seek power. Whether in the guise of religion, nationalism, or spiritual awakening, the formula repeats. A charismatic figure emerges, fear is cultivated, reality is reshaped, and silence becomes complicity until graves surface and the buried truth is forced into daylight. Perhaps the most haunting parallel is not the graves themselves, but the lingering aftermath, the decades of silence, denial, and fragmented memories that follow such events. In Jonestown, Matamoros, Uganda, Switzerland, and now Black Hollow, survivors grapple not only with loss, but with the psychological wreckage of indoctrination, the erosion of trust, and the scars left by manipulation cloaked in faith. Communities fracture, histories are rewritten or erased, and the question of how belief can be twisted into bondage echoes far beyond the grave sites. The mass grave beneath Black Hollow Church is both a regional horror and a global echoer, reminder that no nation, culture, or community is immune to the dark potential lurking beneath the surface of belief. Whether the dead were victims of ritual, forgotten townsfolk consumed by fear, or sacrifices to something older and far more elusive, their fate ties Black Hollow to a worldwide legacy of graves hidden beneath ideology, exploitation, and silence. As the investigation continues, and experts trace connections between Appalachian folklore, ancient symbols, and modern psychological manipulation, Black Hollow becomes another pin on the global map of tragedy, a quiet Appalachian town now forever linked to a history of forgotten graves where faith and fear once entwined, led only to death, and restless questions still clawing their way toward the light. The fog rolls thick over the Appalachian hills as the skeletal remains of Black Hollow Church emerge one final time, weathered stone and rotting timber barely holding against the weight of history. The mass grave beneath its floorboards has been unearthed, the bones catalogued, the symbols analyzed. Yet what lingers in the soilland, in the minds of those left behind, is far from resolved. The story of Black Hollow is not neatly concluded, not etched in stone with tidy answers. It hangs in the mist, unfinished, heavy with the echoes of lost voices and secrets long buried beneath the mountain's decaying skin. The discovery of the grave beneath Black Hollow Church forced a reckoning, a confrontation with the consequences of silence, fear, and unchecked belief. Dozens of lives, erased from official records, buried beneath rituals cloaked in faith and folklore, now laid bare to forensic scrutiny and public speculation. But the most haunting realization is how incomplete that truth remains. Bones tell only fragments, symbols whisper partial histories. The earth gives up pieces, but never the full confession, and so the shadows persist. Reverend Elijah Merrick vanished into them, his ultimate fate unknown, his intentions buried beneath layers of distorted sermons and folklore twisted into doctrine. Were his followers victims of manipulation or willing participants in something older, darker, perhaps entirely outside the bounds of conventional understanding? The answer fractures into competing theories, each plausible, none conclusive. Theories of cult control, of forgotten Appalachian rituals older than settlement, of clandestine experiments or primeval forces stirring beneath the hills. Each possibility fuels the haunting uncertainty that surrounds Black Hollow. Even now, decades after the church doors were boarded shut, the silence hangs heavy. The townsfolk, fractured by trauma, either speak in hushed tones or refuse to speak at all. Survivors carry the weight of indoctrination and loss, their memories unreliable, their scars invisible yet deeply embedded. Investigators and experts debate the symbols, the rituals, the psychological chains that bound belief to tragedy, but beyond their analysis. The land itself seems to remember a quiet, brooding awareness settled deep within the Appalachian earth. The fog over Black Hollow is not merely weather, it is metaphor, a smothering veil of uncertainty, loss, and unanswered questions that refuses to lift, no matter how much is unearthed. The bones have surfaced, yes, but they speak only in fragments. The mass grave is exposed, yet the full horror of how those lives ended, and what was believed, remains cloaked in ambiguity. And so the shadows whisper still, in the empty chapel, in the etched stones forgotten in the cemetery, in the forests, where strange lights once danced and guttural chants carried through the night. The remnants of Black Hollow's secrets refuse to stay buried. The hollowing of phrase, carved into bone, scrawled onto artifacts, spoken in fragmented testimonies, without clear definition, as much a warning as a mystery, as much a threat as a legacy of belief gone unchecked. Black Hollow stands now as more than a decaying Appalachian town. It is a cautionary echo, a reminder that fear, when weaponized by charismatic leaders, when entwined with folklore and isolation, can grow roots deeper than reason, can fracture communities, and can leave graves in its wake, graves hidden beneath the very institutions meant to offer salvation. It is a pattern that reverberates beyond West Virginia's hills, mirrored in tragedies from Jonestown to Matamoros, from forgotten global mass graves to cults still active in the shadows of society. But the most sobering truth is this: some graves should never be forgotten. They demand reflection not only on the horrors unearthed, but on the human conditions that allow them to form: the need for belonging, the fear of the unknown, the vulnerability that isolation breeds, and the terrifying ease with which belief, once distorted, can spiral into darkness. As the final aerial view of Black Hollow Church fades, fog swallowing its skeletal remains, the Himlingaza fractured echo of voices long silenced, of ceremonies performed under moonless skies, of promises twisted into chains. Their story remains unfinished, their warnings unfinished. The earth beneath Black Hollow remembers, and as the shadows whisper still, we are reminded: some mysteries demand answers, but someone buried too long, when left to fester in silence, become restless, clawing their way back to the surface, refusing to stay forgotten. Fade to black. The hymn fades, the unanswered questions remain.